I'm an X-ray tech, and one of my patients is missing his skeleton. The sound was loud in the small room, but after a pause, she made it again. What do you reckon, Carol? I prompted, turning from the X-ray result back to my supervisor's pensive face. Another pause. The patient isn't in any pain? Any symptoms? Not really. He came in for a suspected fracture from training, but hadn't felt anything before that. Nothing out of the ordinary. Carol was lit only by the X-ray screen, the blue light making deep shadows out of her fine wrinkles. Her jaw moved slightly as she processed. Run the procedure again. Calibrate the machine properly. Make sure... All done, Carol. We've scanned him as many times as we safely can. Everyone calibrated the machine. Hell, I X-rayed myself to check. It's all fine. I wasn't used to interrupting a consultant like that, but my heart was racing from what I was seeing. More sharply than I meant to, I indicated the heap of films that showed a full and healthy skeleton picked out in textbook sharp detail from myself, compared horrifyingly to those from the patient sitting quietly next door. For a few minutes, Carol examined each one, her hmms turning to a grinding of teeth. "This is completely impossible," she muttered finally, more to herself than me. "There's no doubt. We checked a dozen. He's got no bones, Jack." I jumped, as much from her swearing as the sudden volume in the enclosed space. A silence fell as we both composed ourselves. The humming of the X-ray screen, the only sound. On that screen was a film showing a translucent human outline. Very normal for X-rays, but instead of the bright lines of bone, there was just nothing. A faint mark, ghost of something where the bone should be, but the skeleton itself was simply missing. Slowly, Carol collected herself. "Okay, talk me through it. Physical examination? There's something there, solid, feels a bit..." I shuddered at the memory of touching the patient, how his tibia seemed to squirm under my fingers. "Wrong. So there's something in there keeping him standing. Follow-up tests? Vitals?" The next few minutes were spent running through heart rate, blood pressure, and other metrics that painted the picture of a perfectly healthy young man who was simply missing bones. Finally, I explained the next steps. "I've got a blood sample here which I'll take to labs. Hopefully that will tell us something." I patted the seated vial in my breast pocket, and I'm waiting on the CT machine to free up next door so we can get a better look at his soft tissues. We wanted your input for that. My bleep went off just as I finished talking, letting me know the scanner was ready. Carol ground her teeth again. "I'm following this. You have my support." I led her through to the waiting room where our patient sat staring idly at the posters opposite. He was a wiry young man with slightly thinning brown hair and casual clothing like a lot of the staff. As we entered, he looked up with a concerned expression, no doubt wondering why so much attention was being given to a minor fracture. But Carol simply introduced herself and asked if she could take some observations, which the man hesitantly agreed to. It was left to me to explain that we'd found a small anomaly, that there was nothing to worry about, but we just needed to confirm a few things before we sent him back to the lab, and would he consent to a quick CT scan? Carol counted his pulse and felt his arm as he gave another reluctant agreement, and once she was done, we walked him to the other room and got him ready for the scan. The control room was next door, separated by a pane of glass and an intercom. Once we settled, I turned to Carol as the machine warmed up. "So, what's your expert opinion?" I asked. No irony in the question. "There's something there of clinical significance," my consultant said guardedly. "I'm very interested in these results." I activated the scanner and the patient began to slide through the huming plastic ring. You being super formal is worse than your swearing, you know. The minutes ground past, my heart beating faster with each one. The patient asked a few questions during the process, if it was safe and if there was anything to worry about, but I reassured him over the intercom and reminded him to stay as still as possible. When he asked what we were doing, I explained that a CT would give us a better view of soft tissues, muscles, and organs and such. Just to check if the fracture had damaged anything, I added, nothing to concern him. Finally, it was done. Barely breathing, I pulled up the results on the screen as Carol craned forwards. "What the?" I zoomed in with shaking hands, not believing what I was seeing myself. Carol was just repeating the word to herself over and over again as her eyes devoured the horror on screen. I panned over the image, but they were everywhere. Everywhere that was meant to have bone had been replaced by quarantine. I looked up at Carol, but she said it again, louder and more firmly. Quarantine, right now. Lock the doors. We need security. Okay, I'll go to... No! Here too, you and me. We've touched the patient. She walked over and locked the operation room door, pulling out her phone and dialing a number at the same time. The door, Jack, now! My skin began itching at her words, pins and needles, and a deep, sickening, crawling sensation. Us too? Quarantine? Contaminated with those? My hand was obeying my superior, though, hitting the button to lock the door of the CT room. The patient's head snapped up at the sound, looking first at the door and then through the window at us. He was starting to panic now. Just a precaution, sir. There's nothing to worry about. My voice was thin, high on the intercom, unconvincing. I didn't care, though. My eyes were fixed on the results screen, on what the CT scan had revealed. Insects, thousands of them, densely packed together, columns running throughout the patient's body, their carapaces picked out at blinding white on the screen. Bodies locked together by spindly legs, needle-thin antennae poking out from the masses. The X-rays had passed right through them, but the CT scan revealed them in sickening detail. The terrible things made shapes, and with horror, I realized they had taken the place of his bones. The radius, ulnar, femur, even the goddamn skull were made from a mosaic of insect bodies, each smaller than a grain of rice. I felt dizzy. I felt them moving. Carol was speaking to someone, and the patient's voice was coming in tinny over the intercom, but I wasn't listening. A cold trickling feeling was spreading throughout my body, and my mind was going faint. All at once, I threw up, missing the bin completely, but managing to at least get the floor and not the equipment. I collapsed hard to the ground. The pungent smell of bile filled the room, adding to the sensory maelstrom. After a moment, I felt myself being lifted and turned to see Carol helping back into the chair. Stay still and breathe deeply, she instructed. Water is on the way, so spit for the moment if you need to. She stood and said something to the patient before turning off the intercom and results screen, leaving only the light from the CT room to fill our little space. It helped a little, but the images were still burned into my mind. Finally, she knelt in front of me, careful to avoid the vomit, and held my arms as she talked me through a breathing exercise. Slowly, I came back to myself, the panic receding. Sorry, I muttered. I don't like bugs. I'm not a fan myself, especially not those ones, she said kindly. Your bones don't feel like them if that helps. Just a few minor cuts. She indicated my arms and a spot of blood on my chest. Before I could reply, Carol's phone rang and she stood to answer it. I shivered and did my best to fight off the feeling of phantom itching from inside my body. Understood. We won't attempt to leave. You don't need to keep saying it, Sue. I know what lethal force is. Water, cleaning supplies too if possible. Yep. Okay. Bye. She let out a shaky breath as she hung up, before looking over to me. We're under instruction to stay in place. These 2 rooms are now considered a quarantine zone. Apparently they've seen something like this before, but it's not a good prognosis. If you have it, well, it's like rabies. Another shaky breath. Once they're in, there's no way to stop them. I felt sick again, but swallowed it down. Questions whirled through my head. They knew these things existed? Is this part of what our facility is studying? What happened to the first patients? Why can't they stop it? Why does my skin itch? Did they really say lethal Before I could voice any of the torrent in my mind, I was jolted by a bang right next to my head. Our patient had come to the joining window and smacked his hand into it, desperate to get our attention. Without the intercom, we couldn't hear any words, but he seemed to be shouting. Jesus, Carol muttered, clearly also startled. She took one look at my face. You stay there. I'll do my best to reassure our patient. Both reassure and our patient seemed to ring slightly hollow in our current situation, but I didn't protest. Carol spent a few minutes doing her best to talk the patient down before giving up and sitting down next to me. As she did, the patient began thumping the diving window again. He's not happy, but there's nothing we can do, she explained grimly. Some symptoms are setting in. Pain, panic, nausea. I didn't tell him what was wrong, though. I couldn't face it. In all my time working with Carol, I'd never seen my consultant look so dejected. As gruff as she was, she'd been a bulwark against all the mess and nastiness of working here, shouldering both responsibility of the patients as well as what we did. "This isn't our fault, Carol. We did the best we could," I tried. "Maybe we could still help him." I mean it. Tests or something. Maybe we can fix whatever those bastards upstairs did to him." This caught her attention. Slowly she looked up, meeting my eyes. All kindness and camaraderie was gone. Instead, there was now a look of steel-hard contempt etched into her face. "Jack, you know what we do here. This is our fault. Those bastards are us. We did this to him." "No," I said, my voice thin again. "No, we're radiology. We just scan the patients, look after them. We don't." "Do you honestly believe that?" she asked sharply. "You think you're not a part of this? Too small of a cog in this place to be noticed?" That you're not responsible. A naive little rad tech that doesn't have blood on his hands? That's not... At least he can admit he makes weapons. At least I, and the patient, and everyone else in this godforsaken place can look ourselves in the mirror and know what we're really doing. "Carol, I didn't..." She was angry, angrier than I'd ever seen her. "Look that poor bastard in the eye and tell him we don't make bioweapons. Look at him through the glass and tell him you're innocent." I felt sick again. Her eyes were cutting through me, pinning me like needles under my flesh. Next to us, the banging on the joining window continued, and I imagined I could hear him howling, but I didn't look. "Can you even tell me his name, Jack? I haven't heard you address him by it." Again, I couldn't answer. Couldn't bring myself to look up at my patient and his screams. Carol made a noise of disgust. "I get it. Like a farmer with cattle, it's easier if you don't get attached, right?" She walked away towards one of the computer terminals. "I'm going to write this shit show up, as well as a recommendation that we review your fitness to practice. I'm not happy having someone of your disposition under me in this facility." She looked at me again. "If you want any chance of keeping your job, I recommend that you look your patient in the eye and come to terms with who you are and what you do." The banging had stopped. Shamefully, I turned to look at the body of my patient. Except he wasn't dead. My heart stopped. In front of the window stood a melting man. His limbs were distending, lengthening and distorting as I looked, skin stretching and bubbling, the spine deformed, bending him forwards horribly towards the glass as his jaw flopped open and his skull collapsed on one side. The stretching skin began to split, white shapes pouring free from the gashes, but now I could barely make it out through a film of tears. I heard myself scream, collapsing down at the same time that poor bastard's legs gave way, and he fell mercifully out of view. I don't know how long I sat there sobbing for. Eventually, Carol's voice came from above me. "This is what we do here, Jack, and you need to be okay with it. For now, I need the sample vial you took from Mr. Juan. You're not fit to keep it safe right now." Shakily, I reached into my chest pocket, obeying without question. Immediately, there was a sharp, burning pain, and I pulled my hand out with a yelp. A half-inch cut wept blood along my index finger. In horror, I looked inside, only to see the glint of a shattered sample vial wink up at me, right where I had landed on it. Terrified, I looked up into Carol's face, which had drained of color. "Right," she said. Okay, I'm going to ask what the transmission vectors of this particular project are. You stay still and over there. Let me know if you feel anything." I simply nodded, unable to speak, trying desperately to ignore the itching coming from deep within my right arm that was slowly spreading upwards. I was hired for night maintenance for an old hospital downtown, picking up trash and soiled linen. Nothing fancy. My new boss, Rick, explained to me that my shift started every night around 9 p.m. "Your first and most important task is to lock all the entryways. We aren't a 24-hour emergency room, and after-hour visitation isn't allowed. We just don't have the staff to handle it." He rambled on for about another 15 minutes about how it was something that they wanted to try to do in order to compete with a newer facility in the upper part of the city, but I wasn't really paying attention. All that I really heard was that besides myself and a few floor techs and night nurses, the hospital was going to be empty. This locks all doors in the building. I suppose by default it also opens them all too. Use it to get into any office you need for cleaning, he told me, passing me a small red and gold key. Seems a bit strange to have just one key to lock up the whole place, I commented. Rick chuckled and gave me a pat on the shoulder. We're not Fort Knox, son. All right, so what do I do after that? I've got a printed schedule of the offices you'll clean every night. No need to break your back doing it all at once, am I right? He passed me some laminated papers that detailed the job and added that it was important to follow the schedule. Marty, the old janitor, got a bit lax and wound up in a bit of trouble, Rick explained. What sort of trouble? I asked, but Rick couldn't say. I was told to report to work that very night. I didn't really have much time to do anything except go home and shower. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but to wonder why anyone would not want to keep a job this cushy. But I wasn't about to blow a golden opportunity. Honestly, though, because I lived so far from the facility, I barely had time to make it back. In fact, by the time I had reached the hospital, the doors were already locked. I reached into my pocket and took out the master key that Rick had given me, unlatching the door and heading inside. It was midway open when I heard a shout from behind me. Hey, hold the door! I turned to see a man wearing blue scrubs rushing toward me. You're running late too, huh? Bruce, he said, shaking my hand as he came in. I took the gesture and then started to lock the door again. Just as I heard the latch close, a car horn honked, and I saw a man with a pregnant woman trying to get in. Hey, hold on! My wife's going into labor! He shouted. At first, I hesitated, thinking that if there was an exception to any rule, this would be it. But I had no idea whether or not the staff at ER would be able to help her, so I shouted through the glass. The emergency room closes at 9. You can go uptown to St. John's. Are you fucking serious? It's 1 minute past! The man shouted back. He looked enraged. I looked down at the key and sighed. I didn't really want to make a mistake on my first day, so I just shrugged and told him sorry again. He said a few more words I won't care to repeat here, beating on the glass a few times. Honestly, his whole demeanor went from frustration to furious in less than 2 seconds, and it was a bit scary. Then Bruce grabbed my shoulder. Hey, what's wrong with you? We can't turn a pregnant woman away, he remarked. But Rick said, he give you that whole spill about the doors and the schedule? Come on, the guy is obviously just wound a little too tight, he remarked, gesturing toward the door. Let them in. Look at her hurt. I looked up again at the irate husband and sighed. Fine, but if I get in trouble, this is your ass, not mine, I muttered. Sure, I'll get them up to labor and delivery, Bruce told me. The husband gave me the stink eye as he helped his wife inside. Then he and Bruce both took her to the elevator as I locked up again and finally headed for the time clock. 15 minutes later, I had grabbed my cleaning cart and was on my way to the first office. Honestly, I was a bit worried about the fact that I had also forgotten the schedule Rick gave me. But once I found a few empty offices and realized the whole floor was empty except for me, I realized I had nothing to be afraid of. I went from office to office doing that for the next 2 hours, finally relaxing when it seemed that nothing was behind the doors except for empty desks and bits of trash. I heard the jingle that played when a newborn is delivered over the intercom and smiled. Bruce had been right. The schedule was just micromanagement. Around 11:39, I took my first break and met a floor tech named Gina in the cafeteria. She was an older white woman that looked like she had just crawled her way out of a war zone. Gruff, tough, and no nonsense. When I explained who I was, she told me she didn't need to know much else. Just make sure you do the job right. Marty got sloppy in those last weeks. Didn't pay as much attention to details as he should. Got himself hurt. I recalled what Rick had warned me about too, and felt a strange, sickening feeling when she made that statement. What do you mean by that? I mean, it's just a silly schedule, right? He had a heart attack, son. And what do you think caused that? He made mistakes, went in places that he shouldn't have, she barked back. Like what? Doesn't matter. Just stick to the schedule, she insisted. I don't even have one, I admitted sheepishly. Her eyes widened and she said a few cuss words. What have you been doing all night? I rambled off the rooms I had cleaned, and with each number her facial expression got more and more disturbed. Did you at least lock them back? Gina snapped. Yeah, of course. But what is the big deal? Bruce said it wasn't important. Bruce? Gina repeated. Yeah, he works on the shift before you. I met him at the time clock. Son, I have been here for 13 years. Ain't no Bruce here. Now it was my turn to be confused. Then, who did I talk to? I whispered. It felt like my heart was going to burst from my chest. I was so nervous. Then an alarm came on over our heads. Code pink. What the hell did you let in here? Gina snapped as I mentally replayed the exchange. I had unlocked the door and let both Bruce and the young couple in. But the door had been locked before then, and Bruce didn't have a key. Fuck! I shouted as I dropped everything and ran toward the stairs. I made it to labor and delivery in about 6 minutes, grabbing the first nurse I could find. What's happened? I shouted, but he told me what I already knew. Someone snatched a baby! She shouted. I was told I had to wait there as security began to search the hospital, but no sign of Bruce or the infant was found that night. I remember telling the police to check the footage of when I let them in, but apparently the camera only showed me and the young couple. To this day, I don't know who Bruce was or how he got away with this, but I've learned to always lock the doors at 9 p.m. and keep them locked no matter what.